After old Joe chopped off his own hand, the strange occurrences didn't stop. In fact, they only got worse. Our quiet little town, once peaceful and serene, became engulfed in an overwhelming sense of unease. People began whispering about black snakes slithering near Joe's house, even though it was the dead of winter when snakes should have been deep in hibernation. The rumors spread like wildfire, stories of shadows moving just beyond the corners of people's vision, faint hissing sounds carried on the wind, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. One particularly cold night, my grandfather was woken by an unusual noise outside. It wasn't the normal creaking of the old house or the howling of the winter wind. It was something else. Slowly he got up, his knees aching from the cold, and cautiously peered out of the window. What he saw made the blood in his veins freeze. A long, winding trail of snakes, black as coal, was silently making its way toward old Joe's house. Their scales shimmered eerily in the moonlight, and they moved with unnatural coordination, almost as if guided by some unseen force. One by one, they slithered into the cracks of old Joe's house, disappearing into the shadows. Grandfather could only watch in disbelief as the last of them vanished from sight. The next morning, Jimmy came knocking on our door again, but this time his face was ghostly pale. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Uncle Mike, something's wrong with Dad." When we arrived at old Joe's house, the stench of rot hit us before we even stepped inside. It was overpowering, like something decaying deep within the walls. Old Joe sat in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself in a low, raspy voice. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if he were being hunted by something only he could see. His skin, once ruddy and full of life, had turned a sickly, mottled grey, and the stump where his hand used to be was now covered in dark, scaly patches, almost like the skin of a snake. Grandpa crouched down beside him. "Joe, what's happening to you?" he asked softly. Old Joe looked up, his eyes wide and filled with terror. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me. The snakes. I hear them, crawling inside the walls." Grandpa's eyes scanned the room, and that's when he saw it. The wallpaper in several places was bulging, as if something was moving beneath it. Faint hissing sounds grew louder, more pronounced, and then, without warning, one of the bulges split open and a black snake slid out, followed by another, and then another. Soon, the room was crawling with them. They slithered across the floor, up the walls, and horrifyingly, they began to wrap themselves around old Joe. His screams filled the room as they coiled tighter and tighter, constricting his arms, his legs, his throat. "We need to get out, now!" Grandpa yelled, pulling Jimmy toward the door. As we fled the house, old Joe's anguished cries echoed behind us, but there was nothing we could do. It felt like the house itself was alive, pulsating with some dark, malevolent energy. The windows rattled and the walls groaned, as if the very structure was twisting and contorting under the weight of whatever evil had taken hold. Later that night, after we had returned home, Grandpa sat in silence by the fire, his face drawn and pale. "Those snakes, they're not ordinary creatures," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "They're tied to something much older, something ancient. And they've been watching Joe for a long, long time." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, ears straining for any sound, afraid that at any moment I might hear the soft hiss of snakes slipping through the darkness. The next morning, the whole town was buzzing with the news. Old Joe had been found dead. His body was twisted, swollen, and covered in hundreds of snake bites. The sight was so horrifying that people refused to talk about it for days. But word spread fast, and soon the legend of old Joe's snake curse became the talk of the town. But it didn't end with old Joe's death. In the weeks that followed, more and more people claimed to have seen black snakes around his abandoned house. Some said they saw his ghostly figure standing in the window at night, his eyes glowing red like the eyes of the very snakes that had killed him. There were whispers that if you dared stand too close to his house after dark, you could hear the faint hissing of snakes and feel the cold, watchful gaze of something lurking in the shadows. Grandpa warned everyone to stay far away, but curiosity got the better of some. Those who ventured too close returned with stories of eerie sights and sounds, all revolving around the cursed presence that still lingered around old Joe's home. The more superstitious folks started leaving offerings at the gate, small tokens of food or trinkets, hoping to appease whatever spirits still haunted the place. But I knew the truth. The curse was real, and it wasn't over. The snakes weren't done with old Joe or the town. Even now, on quiet nights when the wind dies down and the moon hangs low in the sky, I swear I can still hear it. The faint, unmistakable sound of hissing just beyond the edge of the darkness. And I wonder if the snakes are waiting, still seeking their revenge.